Okay, are we ready to start? So I'm not hearing you.
Sorry, yes.
Okay. If you're recording, we'll go ahead and take a moment to read the required right to know script. I'm State Senator Bob Guida, representing District 2. Today we'll be holding a meeting of the Senate Ways and Means Committee. Before we start, I have to read through some announcements to ensure that the meeting we're holding is in compliance with our right to know law. As chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, I find that due to the state of emergency declared by the governor as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and in accordance with the governor's emergency order number 12, pursuant to Executive Order 2020-04 and its extensions, this public body is authorized to meet electronically. Please note that there is no physical location to observe and listen contemporaneously to this meeting, which was authorized pursuant to the governor's emergency order. In accordance with the emergency order, I'm confirming that we're providing public access to the meeting by telephone with additional access possible by video and other electronic means. We're utilizing Zoom for this electronic meeting. All members of the committee and selected legislative staff have the ability to communicate contemporaneously in this meeting through this platform, and the public has access to contemporaneously watch and or listen to the meeting on Zoom or YouTube, in this case Zoom, via phone by following the directions and links provided on the General Court website. We've provided public notice of the necessary information for accessing the meeting in the Senate calendar. We're providing a mechanism for the public to alert the public body during the meeting if there are problems with access. If anyone has a problem, please email remotesenate@leg.state.nh.us. That's all one word, remotesenate@leg.state.nh.us, or call 603-271-6931. That's 271-6931. In the event the public is unable to access the meeting, it will be adjourned and rescheduled. Please note that all votes taken during this meeting shall be done by roll call vote. And finally, let's start by taking a roll call attendance. When each member states their presence, please also state where you are and if anyone else is in the room with you during this meeting, which is required under the right to know law. I'll call the roll. Senator D'Alessandro.
Senator D'Alessandro, I'm in Manchester at home and I'm alone.
Senator Daniels.
Senator Daniels, I'm in the State House office and I'm alone.
Senator Hennessy.
Senator Erin Hennessy, I'm at my home in Littleton and my family is in the house with me.
Senator Rosenwald.
Having some trouble, but she should be here soon.
All right, and I'm Senator Guida, and I am at home with a grandson running around the house and a dog. Wait a moment here for Senator Hennessy to check in. I'm sorry, Senator Rosenwald to check in. Is she showing on screen?
She's not. If you want to go forward, you can always come back to her when we see her.
All right. I'm going to text her very quickly. All right, we'll go ahead and start. Again, thank you all for coming today. We are here for the purposes of receiving revenue estimates from our Department of Revenue Administration, a number of whom will be participating in our call today. And if you wouldn't mind announcing yourselves, that would be very appropriate. It's my pleasure to introduce first and foremost our Commissioner of Revenue, Lindsay Stepp. Commissioner?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Lindsay Stepp, Commissioner at the New Hampshire Department of Revenue Administration. With me today, you'll see Melissa Rollins, Senior Financial Analyst. She will be joining me in the presentation. Also on the call, we have Carolyn Lear, Assistant Commissioner, and Devin Roderick, Financial Analyst at the DRA. I will get started, Senator, if that's okay with you. Okay.
Please, thank you.
Sure, I'll be sharing my screen. Senators, I believe you've received copies of this presentation already. Also, Sonia, let me know that it is also posted on the General Court website for anyone else that would like to follow along. So give me 1 second. Okay, are you able to see the presentation?
Yeah, great. Perfect.
Yes.
Is that better? A little bit
That's
bigger?
better, yeah.
Right, right.
Give me 1 second so I can get it on my screen. There we go.
And just for information, those of us that aren't speaking, just as a reminder, let's remember to mute our screens so we don't create distractions like barking dogs or anything. Thank you.
Okay, so the DRA is here today to present to you fiscal year 21 revenue estimates. So we have developed these revised 21 revenue estimates for the following taxes: the business taxes, meals and rentals tax, tobacco tax, interest and dividends tax, communication services tax, real estate transfer tax, and utility property tax. We calculated these estimates by adjusting fiscal year 21 plan based on currently available data. So that's either through October or November, depending on the various tax type. The expectation and results of revenues take into account the possible changing effects of the COVID-19 pandemic over time, and consideration was also given to the different payment types and tax periods received within a month and how those payments may be affected by the pandemic. Lastly, as always, these estimates are subject to change. They've fluctuated quite a bit since we first began looking at fiscal year 21 revenue estimates back in May. But we're feeling pretty confident about these estimates at this time. These estimates are consistent with what other states are seeing in terms of trends of where, for instance, their corporate business taxes are trending, and also where their sales tax at the meals and rentals level is trending. I will note that this is the same range for fiscal year 21 that we presented on November 23rd. But we have included revenues through November in each slide so that you have a current picture of where revenues stand. I am getting notice that you're unable to see the presentation. So let me try to fix that for you. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second and then I'll reshare. Are you able to see that now? Okay, perfect. Sorry for that complication. Okay, so the first thing I want to cover is the fiscal year 2020 anomalous receivable, which totals for our DRA taxes $30.8 million. So every year, as part of the state's year-end reporting, revenues are converted from a cash basis to an accrual basis. So when we report revenues to you throughout the month and at the end of each month, those revenues are on a cash basis. So what revenue do we receive within that month? The state converts those to an accrual basis where we instead look at, rather than when did we receive the revenue, we look to what is the underlying activity for that revenue. So when we do this, we look at the 60 days, so July and August, the revenue that we receive in those 60 days, and when did the underlying activity occur? If the other underlying activity occurred in the prior fiscal year, we're able to pull that revenue back into the prior year. These amounts are fairly consistent year to year and don't usually create much fluctuation. However, as is the case with many things, 2020 was different. So the amounts for 2020 for business taxes and interest and dividends tax, so that 18.3 million that you see on the screen and the 9.2 million, those are amounts that we received in July and August, where the underlying activity is for the prior year. Those are anomalous due to the change in the federal due date. So as you may recall, at the federal level, the April 15th due date changed from April 15th to July 15th. However, at the state level, we changed the due date from April 15th to June 15th. However, we did have many taxpayers that still followed the July 15th date at the federal level. So even though that wasn't the due date in New Hampshire, taxpayers still followed that July 15th date. So this 18.3 million and 9.2 million are primarily due to the fact that businesses followed the July 15th date instead of the June 15th date, and we'll be pulling that money in the CAFR back to fiscal year 20 from fiscal year 21. The other contributing factor is the amounts of the 60-day receivable were more than what we preliminarily estimated in some instances, and this was just really a timing issue. When we needed to provide the estimates for the 60-day receivables, we hadn't yet received much of the revenue in July and August, and so our estimates just ended up being a little bit off. So again, this 30.8 million in total is going to show in our cash basis numbers when we talk about fiscal year 21, because the revenue did come in the door to DRA in fiscal year 21. But it's also going to show in the fiscal year 20 audited financials of the state. The reason why this is important is today we're going to talk about fiscal year 21, and so we don't really need to worry too much about this 30.8 million. You just need to know that it's included in our numbers. But as we move forward and you begin the revenue estimating process, what's typically done is you take fiscal year 21 and you determine a growth rate for 22 and 23. When we look to apply that growth rate to fiscal year 21, we're going to want to remove these amounts from that fiscal year 21 base because we don't anticipate this to occur again. As in, if you included this revenue, this is really revenue that was supposed to be received in April. We received it late in July. This coming year, it'll be received in April on time. So we can talk more about this when we get to the 21 base and the 22 and 23 estimates, but just know we will want to remove this from fiscal year 21 before applying any growth estimates when we're estimating fiscal years 22 and 23. Any questions on that before we move forward? No, looks like we're good. Okay, now we're going to get into the individual taxes. As I mentioned when we started, Melissa Rollins will be joining me this afternoon. She and I will kind of be tag teaming and going back and forth. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to talk about M&R.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. So before I get started, I just wanted to make you familiar and comfortable with the layout that we have, because you'll see this for each tax that we administer. So the top portion will just be the tax and any information necessary to the tax. The next section is—
I'm sorry, I can't hear her.
Yeah, I share that same problem. It's very hard to hear you, Melissa.
Is there a chat function? No,
Can you hear me now?
no.
Still very faint.
Okay, how about now?
Still pretty faint.
Can you hear me now?
Very weak.
No.
Melissa, maybe if you just speak a little bit louder, I'm
Yeah.
able to hear you okay. You might just need to speak up a little bit.
Okay. What if I talk like this? Can you hear me like this?
It's better.
Okay, I'll just talk really loud. Okay, so the first portion we have is factors to consider. This will just be what we took into account for coming up with our revenue estimates. And then we flow into DRA revised fiscal year 21 estimate ranges. And this will be our low and our high, and we'll explain how we get there. And then at the bottom of some pages or on the next page, we will have our month over month changes compared to plan and how we adjusted those, as well as what the plan numbers actually are. And that's just sort of a snippet from the first screen that Lindsay showed to show what our low is and our high is for fiscal year 21, and then what that looks like compared to plan. All right, to get started, meals and rentals tax has three components. It has the meals tax. This makes up about 80% of the tax. The rooms tax, this makes up 17% of the tax. And the motor vehicles tax, which makes up about 3% of the tax. Fiscal year to date, this tax has been highly affected by COVID-19. We're 40.6 million or 21.7% below plan. And this has 1.6 million of that anomalous receivable that Lindsay spoke about. And then we're 29.3 or 16.7% below prior year. And this is through November. As I said, we do know that this tax has been affected by COVID. We all have experienced it and sort of gone through it with buying meals and the renting of rooms and renting of motor vehicles. We know we had stay-at-home orders. Hotels were shut down. There were limited capacities in restaurants. Those have major effects on the meals and rentals tax, as well as unemployment rates and consumer confidence. Taxpayers having money to go out and purchase meals and eat out, as well as them just trying to stay safe as we sort of navigate this new world right now. Also, a factor to consider is the COVID-19 vaccine. That's obviously starting to go out, but that should result in some more consumer confidence in having taxpayers venture out again. We have the shift in trends from restaurants to fast food, and hotels to camp and cottages. We have individual data on these industries with meals and rentals tax. And for October activity reported in November, restaurants are down 9% compared to last year. However, fast food is up 9%. So that sort of shows the shift in how consumers are out in the world and adjusting to this pandemic. I do want to point that restaurants do bring in more money, probably twice as much money as fast food, but we thought that trend was an interesting point. Also, when looking at hotels, full service hotels, the big brick and mortars that we know of, those are down 36.4% compared to online platforms and rental agents. Those are up 57.7%. So again, hotels double the amount of revenue brought in versus these rental agents and camps and cottages. But I just think it's an important piece to note that, again, the trends are shifting where people are feeling more comfortable in smaller locations than in the bigger hotel chains. Moving down to our revised estimate, you can see on the screen, our low is negative or a loss of 94.6 million or 24% below plan. And our high is 74.3 million or 19% below plan. For our low, how we got to this number, the reductions were based on the M&R performance over the last few months. These reductions were coupled with an anticipation of seeing deeper losses in colder months and a slower recovery as it tends to warm in the spring and the vaccine is more available. We adjusted in this scenario, we adjusted the revenue to mirror December through April as what we saw in August revenue, July activity, which was a loss of 25%. So essentially our low is just taking what we saw during the lower points of the pandemic and applying those to the next 6 months of the fiscal year. And as for our high, we based that on the M&R revenue over the last month. So we sustained the October loss through the winter months, which I believe was about a negative 15%. And then we accelerated that starting in April with the anticipation of the vaccine being more available and people having more confidence to venture out. So again, this adjusted the revenue to negative 15% for the winter and spring months. And then we accelerated that gain to 10% sooner as people ventured out more quickly and they were more confident. And you can see that everything that I just discussed for the low and high, you can see those in our charts now. The first portion of the chart is July through October actual numbers. So those are where we landed compared to plan. And then the second part of the first chart is our fiscal year 21 estimated compared to plan. Just for some context, November is now obviously over. We ended up 14% below plan, so pretty close to our negative 15% below plan estimate. And then you can see what I was speaking about for December through June on the low side. Those are some pretty big dips, but those matched what we saw in August. And then on the high side, you can see we sustain the low point that we're seeing now in November and sustaining that through March, and then decreasing the loss to 10% for the summer into spring months. And that brings us to, again, a low of 292.3 and a high, which is 94.6 below plan, and a high of 312.6, which is 74.3 above plan. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
This is Senator Guy to Melissa. You said that the 74.3 was above plan. I think you probably meant below.
Oh, below plan. I apologize. Thank
Okay,
you.
I just want to be clear because I would be ecstatic if that were the case.
Sorry to get your hopes up.
And Melissa, when will you make further adjustments? Because we have noticed a couple of things that more shutdowns are in place. They put in the curfew in Nashua, and more and more of the in dining has been curtailed. Do you think that I'm thinking about December and January as being months, popular months for dining out, Christmas, New Year's, et cetera? Will there be a significant adjustment, or will we go by what you've got here?
I think we're definitely keeping an eye on revenues on a pretty regular basis, and we'll monitor to see if that December and January will fall below our low of negative 25%, and then make adjustments as needed. This chart will continue to update it as needed to sort of shift that over to actual compared to plan. But I imagine we're going to take a good look at December for other taxes because it's a pretty big month, and probably look at what the revenues will be in January again.
Great, thank you.
Melissa, I have a question on the rentals and rooms piece of it, and I guess meals too. How much of the differential between the low and the high is related to what other states are going to do with their travel restrictions? Mostly I'm talking about Massachusetts and their requirements for somebody to quarantine after they return to the state if they come here.
Yeah, great question. So for the meals and rentals portion of it, we mirrored it based on, like I said, based on the activity in July and August, which I think may be similar to what Massachusetts had restrictions on at that point. I think what their changes are sort of going back to how they had the restrictions, like I said, in June and July. So I think if that was the case, we'd probably lean closer to the low of the negative 25%. That piece would be factored into that section.
Okay, seeing no other questions, we will move on to the tobacco tax. So this is actually a very well-performing tax at the moment, and we'll kind of talk about why. Historically, tobacco tax has been one that has usually consistently decreased year over year. And that's not what we're seeing at this point, and we'll talk a little bit about why. So first, factors to consider: fiscal year to date, we are 18 million or 20.1% ahead of plan. 1.3 million of this is the anomalous receivable. And we are 19.7 million or 22.3% ahead of prior year. So again, that is different from historical trends where we would typically see a year over year reduction in the tobacco tax.
Yeah.
There's really two things that are happening here. First, it appears that wholesalers stocked up in the months at the beginning of the pandemic when it was unsure, or they were unsure about what their future was going to bring. Were they going to be able to remain open? And so they did seemingly stock up to have some inventory on hand in the event that they needed to adjust their operations. In addition, Massachusetts implemented a ban on mentholated tobacco and other flavored tobacco products in June that has continued to give us a bump in revenue. We've talked to folks in Rhode Island as well, and the state of Rhode Island is seeing an increase in their tobacco tax revenue as well. We did reach out to both wholesalers and retailers about the potential impact on the ban of mentholated products in Massachusetts. And wholesalers responded saying that they are seeing a significant increase in their sale of mentholated products, in particular mentholated cigarettes. In some cases, the sales of these products have doubled compared to when the ban in Massachusetts was not in place, and they are now selling as much as the non-mentholated products. In addition, we reached out to retailers along the border with Massachusetts, and again, the tobacco tax is at the wholesale level, so we don't always engage with the retailers directly, but we do have a good working relationship with them. And so along with the Liquor Commission, we reached out, and a lot of retail store owners have seen an increase in sale of products due to the flavor ban, indicating that there are cross-border sales, which we've known about. And it's really along the border, along our highways, so 93 and 95, retailers in those areas have seen a significant increase, and it is consistent with when the ban went into effect. Also, there have been various news articles that although smoking cigarettes can be a risk factor with respect to COVID, the stress of the pandemic has caused people to maybe smoke more or decide maybe that now is not the time to quit smoking. So again, even though it's a risk factor, for some folks, it's also a way that they use to cope with anxiety. And certainly our numbers have shown that we are not seeing a reduction in the sale of tobacco products.
Lindsay, can I ask a question about this?
Sure.
Thank you. I mean, we know that cigarettes are linked with addiction and also with mental illnesses. Do you have a breakdown for how much of the increase is purchases from out-of-state people and how much is from New Hampshire residents who are perhaps smoking more?
We don't have that level of detail at the DRA. However, I can share or send to you, there is an article that the Tax Foundation published about cigarette taxes and cigarette smuggling by state. So what percentage of the cigarettes consumed in a state were purchased in another state. And New Hampshire is the largest exporter of cigarettes. So we see a significant portion of our sales in New Hampshire are to people who will consume those cigarettes out of state.
Wouldn't we see the same correlation with alcohol sales though?
Possibly. We don't collect the tax on alcohol, so I don't have that same insight and data into that, but you may see that as well. The tobacco tax in particular, though, the difference between the tax rate in New Hampshire compared to surrounding states is fairly significant. And then with the ban on mentholated products, or any flavored products, you can't purchase those in Massachusetts anymore, I think is really driving folks to New Hampshire to purchase the products.
Thank you.
So our low estimate is that we would land 32.1 million or 16% ahead of plan. And this is based on the numbers continuing to increase and people slowing their usage, potentially due to unemployment or people not wanting to venture out or the inability to venture out if there were restrictions in New Hampshire, or as Senator Hennessy referenced, technically, if you're coming across the border to buy cigarettes from Massachusetts, you should be going back and quarantining. So there is the potential that that could have an impact on us. So that produces our low. Our high would be 43.6 million or 22% ahead of plan. And this is where we think we would land if we continue to see the increase in the trend of people smoking, continuing to stock up on products, and the continued cross-border sales that we've seen with Massachusetts. Again, you can see the month-over-month changes to plan that we anticipate. Similar to M&R, July through October are actual numbers. November through June are our estimates. November came in at about 18% ahead of plan, so that was within our range, and so we did not update our range based on the November actuals since it was consistent with what we were expecting. Any other questions that I can answer on tobacco? Okay, we'll move on to interest and dividends tax.
All right, interest and dividends tax. This tax has a few components that it's made up of. 40% is taxable annuities or actual cash and property distributions. 38% is dividend income. 15% is interest income, and 8% is federal tax exempt interest income. So fiscal year to date, this tax is doing pretty well. We're 20.9 or 85% ahead of plan. And of course, this includes that 9.2 million anomalous receivable. And we're 19.8 or 77% ahead of prior year. This tax is prone to some historical year-over-year swings. So if you trended this out for the last 10 years, you would see a chart that goes up and down and has some pretty big drops and some pretty big peaks. So it is a harder one to predict. The stock market continues to perform well, which is a taxable event when you're getting those distributions or dividends, as well as people having more money in the bank. Those two items bode well for this tax. And then, as I said, this tax appears to be unaffected by COVID to date. So far it's performing pretty well. With that being said, both of our high and low ranges we do expect this tax to exceed plan. Our low is 16.4 million or 14% ahead of plan, and our high is 23.8 million or 20% ahead of plan. How we got to those numbers is we adjusted December through June to be 4% below plan. And that 4% comes from the estimated GDP loss for the year, which is between -3% and -4%. The reason we are putting a low in there when we have seen positive activity in this tax is because we do have a final true-up payment that's coming in January for estimates. And we are unsure as to what that estimate is going to look like, whether it's going to hit plan or it's going to be below plan. So we wanted to put some cushion in there in case taxpayers have just been making some standard payments as they did in prior years, and then they plan on truing it up in the fourth quarter. We applied that -4% to December as well because some taxpayers do make early December payments. And then we also have in the second half of the fiscal year, the returns will be filed. And those are due in April. And again, we could see some true-up situations there. So that also has the 4% applied. And then for our high, we adjusted the November through June to be 4% ahead of plan. And this equates to the 4% growth that we saw in September, which was the last estimate payment we received and the largest month we've had in this current fiscal year. So essentially just saying the trends will still stay the same for the rest of the fiscal year and will continue to be 4% ahead. And again, we definitely think it's a possibility that we will continue to be ahead of plan every month as we have been thus far. And then in the chart below, this just shows what our estimates look like, what we just discussed. November, because we do have November now, we came in 100% ahead of plan, but I do want to note that November is a very small month. I think just it's typically around 800,000. So even though that sounds really large, in the scheme of things, it's not very big. So we trend out that negative 4% for the rest of the year, or for our high 4% above for the rest of the year. That results in 133.3 for our low, which is 16.4 ahead of plan, and our high is 140.7, which is 23.8 ahead of plan. Happy to answer any questions on this tax.
Melissa, do you anticipate the vaccine impacting this tax at all? The presence of the vaccine? I mean, it's got to be a positive factor in some respects as far as the other revenues, but.
I don't, Lindsay, if you have anything else. I don't think it would, just because it is based on interest income and dividend and distributions. But Lindsay, if you have anything to add to that.
I think certainly the vaccine will be good for the general economy, and with dividends and distributions being a component of IND. When the economy performs well, IND tends to perform well. So I think there's definitely a relationship there. There might not just be a direct or specific correlation that we would necessarily account for, but obviously the economy trending in a positive direction means a positive trend for IND as well.
All right. Next question, I guess, is it's not a political question, but with President Biden, do you anticipate that having an impact on this tax, on people's, investment strategies and so forth?
We have not taken that into account at this time, and we'll, I think, see as the Biden administration comes in and what is potentially contemplated in terms of any changes to federal code or that sort of thing. We will factor that in as our estimates move along through the process, but there's nothing particular that we've taken into account at this time.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move on to the communication services tax. This tax is actually pretty straightforward. We have not actually produced a range here because it just is trending the way generally we expected that it would. So fiscal year to date, we are 0.6,600,000 or 3.5%, excuse me, below plan. And we are 200,000 or 1.2% ahead of prior year. I would note here that there was an amount included in our fiscal year 21 revenue estimate. So $2.5 million of the full revenue estimate for fiscal year 21 was attributable to the legislative change to the taxability of VoIP and prepaid calling cards. And so you'll see we're ahead of prior year, but we're below plan. And I think what we're seeing is we just haven't reached that level of revenue that we were anticipating with VoIP and prepaid calling cards just yet. So that's really the difference that we're seeing. Otherwise, this tax is performing as we would expect. Obviously, the New Hampshire unemployment rate, which is looking better at this point, is something to just generally consider when you're talking about this tax and folks' ability to pay their telecommunications bills. Obviously, the moratorium on shutting off service helped so that people retained their communication services through their telephones. But if the unemployment rate gets higher, we may see a decrease in the services that are provided, which could impact revenue. We're also looking at the taxability of video conferencing, increased use of that product like we're using today. And again, the use of VoIP and prepaid calling cards just hasn't come to fruition yet where we were expecting. It may over time. There is typically a learning curve when we change the taxability of products. And so that may correct itself. So our estimate is that we'll be 900,000 or 2% below plan for the year. Again, it didn't produce a range because this tax is just generally performing pretty consistently. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Oh, just one. I did suggest a change in how we administer that tax, but it was defeated. And we thought that would have produced another 2 million a year in revenue. We'll try that. We'll try that again.
Sure.
We get a lot of pushback on that, but indeed, it's not a new tax. It's just a compliance issue.
Sure. And this tax historically was declining over a number of years, and it seems that we have now kind of leveled out a little bit, and this is performing at least a little bit more consistently than it has in the past. Okay, we can move on to the real estate transfer tax.
One quick question on that communication service tax. And you go to factors to consider. We're 600,000 below plan. 200,000 of this is anomalous. Does that mean that we're actually 800,000 below?
Melissa, help me here.
Yeah, so 200,000 will go back.
Right.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
And so to that same point, we're about even with prior year when you take out the anomalous receivable.
All right, moving on to real estate transfer tax. This tax has been performing well in the current economy. I'm sure you've seen a lot of news articles on this. Fiscal year to date, we're 7.2 million or 9% ahead of plan, and 3.7 million or 4.4% ahead of prior year. I do want to note that there was a new $5 million transfer to the Affordable Housing Fund this year. It was new in legislation. So fiscal year to date ahead of prior year, when comparing apples to apples, you really need to add that 5 million back in to prior year. So really we would be 8.7 million ahead of prior year. And for plan, the 5 million was accounted for in plan. However, it was spread out over the 12 months. So the 5 million really should be some part of that should be added to the 7.2 million. So it is performing even better than what you would look at when you're looking at those numbers. The factors for this are the mortgage interest rates are being historically low, and they seem to continue to be trending out that way. Virtual home sales, available housing, and property values. Definitely factors to consider with this. Property values are increasing, which I'll speak to a little bit lower, while available housing is decreasing. And the virtual home sales is something fairly new that's been occurring during this pandemic. I don't know if it was widely used prior to it, but I did attend a seminar on some of this, and there are now people who are buying homes virtually, people that may be coming from urban areas and moving to rural areas, and they're able to buy homes without even stepping foot in the home before buying it based on this virtual home sale, which is interesting. And then overall recovery of the economy, unemployment rates, and consumer confidence obviously have a part in this tax. RET continues to perform well, like we spoke about, with large gains compared to last year. However, we are concerned about an inventory shortage. We're also coming into winter months, so there'll be some stunted construction, as well as any increased COVID cases, which may make buyers weary. That's anticipated in our estimate. And lastly, we look to New Hampshire Association of Realtors website. They have some good information every month. And their October one produced in November, there's a statement that they put out there saying multiple offers remain a common occurrence in many areas, keeping housing hot while temperatures continue to fall. And then also speaks of while prices often dip a bit in the winter months, continued buyer demand may temper any price retreats this year. So we may not see the typical dip that we do see in the winter. They also have listings and stats on what their homes are what the home listings are looking like. So single family homes are up 12.7%. Pending sales have increased almost 30% for single homes. The median sale price is up 17.5%. And then that monthly supply decreased to 60%. So just a good website that we look at, good place to reference some stats. For our DRA revised estimate, our low, we have 9.6 million or 6% ahead of plan. And our high is 18.8 million or 12% ahead of plan. The low is based on lost revenue to people sort of hibernating or hunkering down during the next peak of COVID that we're entering in here, in the winter months being slow based on construction. This would mean our spring into summer would be gradual increase, but not the same dramatic increase that we saw during the summer. And then our high, we adjusted to account for continued increases in pricing as well as housing still cellular with realtors' ability to do the virtual home sales, which I spoke about earlier. And that's unlike at the beginning of when COVID happened, where everything sort of slowed right down and they weren't able to do those at that point. We do account for continued reduction due to decreased inventory and a slowing of construction, just not as drastically as our estimate in the low range. So here we have November through June. I want to point out November is basically actuals because when we did our revenue estimate last, we had those numbers. So that's why the number is so high. And then December, because this tax is due on the 10th of the month, we already have those preliminary numbers. So December was another good month and it's going to come in around 49.7% ahead of plan. That might alter some as we get final numbers in. So that came outside our range of the 31%. And it was just a good month. Counties were up 26.2% compared to prior year for the reporting revenue. So it looks like that trend is still continuing through December. And then as you can see, the January through June for our low is a 2% straight flat rate across the board. And then our high is slowly decreasing it, but not as fast, and then maintaining a 10% ahead of plan. So that gets us for our fiscal year 21 estimates of our DRA low of 168 or 9.6 ahead of plan, and our high of 177.2 or 18.8 ahead of plan. Any questions?
Yeah, do you anticipate that the dwindling inventory is going to flatten? I know you say you've accounted for that, but how much of a factor is that going forward into the latter part of next year?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something we keep keeping our eye out for. We have factored that into our low estimate, where we're saying those constraints just happen pretty tightly over the winter, like we said, as construction slows, and that inventory may even decrease. So that's really the biggest difference between our low and high, is that inventory constraint.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and we've talked about in previous presentations over the years, when you're doing revenue estimates for MET or for RET, you need to take into account, you know, not only the fact that the volume of the home sales, you need the home sales to occur, but also what are the homes selling at? And
Right.
you could have a high volume of sales at low dollar values, or you could have a low volume of sales at high dollar values, and they could almost produce the same amount of revenue. So that's why we constantly watch both the the sale prices and the volume of the transactions. And as Melissa mentioned, over the past few months, we've seen both high volume and high dollar value. We anticipate that volume will maybe decrease, but potentially that dollar value will stay the same.
Yeah, and just, I did say the volume of transactions this month, the dollar value was 26.2% ahead, but the transactions were also 23.7 ahead. So,
right? So we're still seeing high levels of both the volume and the value, but that may not sustain. Okay. So the next tax we're going to talk about is the utility property tax. Fiscal year to date, we are 1.8 million or 15.9% ahead of plan, and 2.3 million or 21.3% ahead of prior year. Things to think about when we're looking at how this tax will perform between now and the end of fiscal year 21. We do have some taxpayers with credits on file, and so we do need to factor in the utilization of those credits. Some property may decline in value due to changes in economic conditions. So in particular, we're seeing pretty dramatic decreases in value for our generation plants. And that's really due to decreases in the wholesale price of energy that has declined about 50% since 2018. And so that's obviously impacting the amount of money that the generation plants receive and therefore decreasing their value. So we have decreased values at the generation plants. However, we're seeing some increase in values in the electric distribution and the transmission plants. And so we need to kind of factor all of those changes in together to see where values will land. It does look like we may see a decrease, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. The other thing to consider is that new taxable property can be constructed at any time, and we're constantly looking at utilities that come online, and they will come onto the utility property tax rolls. So again, like the communication services tax, I tend to get the easy ones. We don't have a range here because we generally feel fairly confident where the tax is going to go. So UPT does not appear to be affected by the COVID-19 economic crisis at this point. Estimated payments relate to the previous year's tax. So the December 2020 estimated payment that will be received this month will be based on the tax previously assessed in December of last year. Just yesterday, we sent out our new utility property values for the coming year. So every December, the utilities get a new value. They make their estimated payments based off of the prior year. And then in January, they do a true-up payment if required. So you'll see when I flip to the next page, we do anticipate that the estimated payments coming in between now and the end of the fiscal year will be about 10% lower than planned, and that is due to the decrease in the values that we just sent out yesterday. So you'll see here, as I go to the next slide, you'll see that negative 10% in January for the true up based on the valuations again that were just sent out. And then you'll see the 10% decrease in April and June, the next two estimated payments that need to be, that are required. That results in a 3% decrease from plan when you take into account the whole year. So plan is 44.2 million, and we are estimating that we will come in at 43 million at the end of the year. And I'm happy to answer any questions on the utility property tax. Okay, are we ready for the fun one? I'm going to talk about taxes. And Melissa gets to do this one.
Ooh.
Rank has its privileges.
Yeah, right.
all right, business taxes. So we know the business taxes are made up of the business profits tax and the business enterprise tax. Historically, that's typically a 60-40 split, with 60% of the revenue being business profits tax and 40% being business enterprise tax. So far this tax is performing fairly well. fiscal year to date, we're 60.5 million or 30.5% ahead of plan. That does include the 18.3 million of the anomalous receivable. And we're 55.8 million or 27.5% ahead of prior year. Things that we considered was the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on business activity, potential for cash flow issues that could affect the ability for taxpayers to make their payments. Another federal government stimulus package. I read this morning that the Speaker and the Senate are coming together, so let's see if that happens. And then we just wanted to point out that we do anticipate revenues could exceed plan rather than the larger loss that we were originally anticipating. I know when we were talking about this tax, I believe it was in May, we thought this tax was going to take a huge nosedive, and that hasn't occurred. So we've definitely adjusted this, and that, looking at that, it's due to the performance of September, October, and November revenues. And other states are also showing this increase in business taxes. And sort of when we drilled down into this increase that we keep seeing over plan each month, it's our large taxpayers are the ones that don't seem to be impacted by this pandemic. We know that businesses have taken a hit. We've seen it in the news, we've heard about it, but it seems like our largest taxpayers, those ones that are in our triangles, business tax triangles that most of you are familiar with in our annual report, they seem to be carrying us through this. And some of those industries are home improvement stores, medical industries, technological industries, and box stores. They're performing better than their prior year and definitely have decreased our anticipated loss of revenues. Looking at what we estimated out for our fiscal year 21 estimate ranges, for those of you that are not familiar with our presentation, how we went about our estimates this time around compared to last time around is that we did look at each individual payment type that we receive for taxes, business taxes, so estimates, extensions, returns, and tax notices, and we looked at them individually and how they were possibly affected by COVID-19 versus looking at as a whole and sort of making a determination. And I'm going to speak to it below how we adjusted each of those tax payments. So our low for this tax was negative 17.7 million or 2% above plan. And our high is 6.1 million or 1% above plan. So to get to our low, when we originally did this presentation, we adjusted November. We adjusted November to be 35 million, and it came in at 34.5 million. So that was a big increase for November. That put us at 22.1 million ahead of plan for November. So November was a good month. And then for the remaining months, we did a 3% increase for returns and extension payments compared to plan. That was applied to December through January. And this was the gain from March through October return and extension payments. So looking at what we've received in the new year, again, from March through October, we had a 3% increase on return and extension payments, and we applied that through December and January. And then we reduced the February through June to a negative 18% for returns and extension payments. And this large reduction we tied to the prior recession that we had in 09 and 010. We know that this economic condition that we're in is not the same as the prior recession. However, when we were trending out estimate payments and return payments, there were some factors that were definitely isolated in those same periods. So we pulled those out, but then we did make an adjustment to account for the economic environment that we're seeing today. And that's where we got to the negative 18% that we applied through February and June. The next part, we went and looked at estimate payments. So again, that was just for returns and extension payments. And again, those return payments are going to come in April, and that's where we're going to see how much of these taxpayers were affected, because we'll have the full returns instead of just estimates coming in. So estimates compared to plan, we reduced to 10% through January. And this is tied through March through October estimate payments lost compared to prior year. So again, we looked at estimate payments from March through October, they're 10%. We applied those through January for the estimate payments. And then we adjusted the remaining payments, estimate payments for February through June to 3% below plan. And that correlates again with the GDP figures of being -3% to -4% for the prior year, similarly like IND. We did not make any adjustments to tax notice payments in our low. And this was because our collection and audit activity has resumed on some levels, and the performance of tax notice payments have resumed to normal. So no need to adjust to that payment. And then I should note that everything that I've spoke about so far is the same way that we did our high number, except for refunds. So the factor for refunds is that we increased refunds compared to what we typically expect in fiscal year 21 by 45%. So this is an essentially 118% each month for December through June with a couple of modifications. And that's essentially making these refunds match last year's refunds. And this is because last year we had anomalous refunds from large corporations. And because we know these large corporations are driving the increase so far this year, we wanted to make sure that we accounted that they could be asking for some of this money back as they're filing their returns December through June, because there are some fiscal year filers. So this accounts for that situation and brings us to that low of the -2%. And then the high, the 6.1 million or 1% ahead of plan, like I said, that's everything that I just went over for the adjustments to returns, extensions and estimate payments. That's all the same as what we just talked about, except we don't adjust the refunds in this portion, and just refunds, we're assuming this scenario will remain as anticipated and we won't see this large request come back over the next 6 months.
Melissa, what about people claiming their accrued tax credits? When will that happen?
Sure. So if they have credit carriers on file, for those of you that don't know what that is, that's when a taxpayer overpays their taxes and they have an overpayment on file. They can either take that overpayment as a refund, or they can carry that overpayment into the next tax return. And one would think that those may be more utilized this year because as taxpayers have less money, they're going to dip into those overpayments. And that would be accounted for in the refund, the low number.
Okay.
To date, we haven't seen an overly large request of refunds, so we haven't seen that yet. But if we were going to see it, we would see it primarily in March and April.
That's what I thought, March and April. And what it appears, just a query, we get so much of this tax from so few people.
Yeah. So for those, I referenced triangles before. For those of you that aren't familiar with our triangles, which essentially says how many taxpayers pay what portion of tax, about 76 taxpayers pay 49% of this tax. And to take it to one step up, around 600 taxpayers pay about 78% of this tax. So this taxpayer, when we say a triangle, it's, an upside down triangle with the top portion having more people paying less tax. And as you filter down, a small amount of taxpayers out of our, I'm going off the top of my head, I think it's around 60,000, 70,000 taxpayers. 600 pay 78% of the tax. So very small portion.
Yeah.
And as Melissa alluded to in the earlier slide with factors to consider, the pandemic hasn't impacted every business exactly the same. We've had those winners and losers. And so the winners still owe tax and are going to be in that point of the triangle. And so we still have those. It might not be the same 600 taxpayers, but we still have that portion of the triangle that's producing that significant amount of the revenue.
Melissa, you mentioned that the large corporations were driving this. Have you got any kind of a breakout between the effects of the large corporations and the small businesses, and an effect why the small, what is affecting the small businesses versus the large ones?
We don't have this at that point. I don't think we've drilled down into it at that level, because right now you sort of have, for instance, proprietorships. Those are normally our smaller businesses. And for estimates for those group of taxpayers, they've sort of remained the same every month in estimate payment. So if you compared them to last year, they had 0% growth. But then if you go and look at the corporate taxpayers, those larger taxpayers, and sometimes it's very few of those taxpayers are coming in and paying a tremendous amount more than they were paying in prior years, really driving up our numbers, like you see in November, 182% ahead of plan. If you'd like, we can drill into that data a little bit more to give you exact numbers, but that's sort of where we're seeing it. Where, like I said, we're seeing the proprietorships are sort of remaining flat, and then the corporations are exceeding what they've paid in prior years on a regular basis.
Melissa, you mentioned it at the beginning that a number of the payers of the BPT filed their payments a month late. It was supposed to be June 15th, but they didn't file until July. Is there a penalty for being late on that? And would that be counted towards the anomaly or booked in this year?
Sure. So those, Lindsay, I don't know if you're heavily involved in this. So if you want to take that, I'll pass it on.
Sure, those returns were late. So tax notices did go out with interest and penalties. Taxpayers can appeal them if they feel like there was just an honest mistake, and we evaluate those on a case-by-case basis. By the time those penalties and interest are actually paid, it's likely outside of the 60-day window that we look at revenue to bring into the prior year. So it's unlikely that it had a significant impact on the anomalous receivable. It's more likely that we sent those bills out in August, end of July, early August, and they were maybe paid in September. So that would fall outside of the 60 days.
If I could ask one more question. It's my understanding that in some cases, the federal PPP money was subject to the BPT. And is that why some of these months are ahead of plan?
So that's a good question. And we have talked about PPP a couple of times now. I know Senator Morse has asked, and we are in the process of doing a more specific analysis about PPP, other federal aid, and also state aid and the potential impact on the business taxes. And we'll be ready with that presentation for January. But at a high level, PPP is not taxable at the federal level. So it's not included in your gross income, but you do not deduct any expenses. So if you use that PPP to pay wages, typically wages are a deductible expense. However, you cannot take a deduction on your federal return for those wages. In New Hampshire, PPP is going to be included in your gross income. However, you are going to be able to take a deduction for those expenses. So very simply, at the end of the day, the bottom line is likely to be the same. If you spent all of your PPP on deductible expenses, it will net to zero. That may not always be the case depending on what various businesses did with the PPP, but that's kind of the ultimate outcome, is that it is the same. There is some talk at the federal level of not including PPP in gross income and also allowing the deductible expense, which would then result in a decrease in the taxes due compared to what you would pay in New Hampshire, but that has not been formally approved or really gained much traction, I guess, at this point. So we will, like I said, we're looking into PPP. We have the list of businesses and how much each business received. We'll evaluate what industry those businesses are in. Obviously, some PPP was received by people that may not be taxable here in New Hampshire, but we're trying to dig into that data more, and we'll have a better analysis for you at the beginning of January.
Thank you.
Lindsay, Senator Morse, I just recently read an advice that went out that businesses, and these are specifically New Hampshire, I believe, are being advised not to pay taxes on the PPP until they true up in March or April. You know, they keep up with their regular tax payments, stay legit there, and then the PPP gets caught up. So how would we possibly catch up? How would we know where that's going until we get into March or April?
You're right. We might not know for sure the actual outcomes until March and April, and we see some of those final returns come in. But we can make some estimates based on the amount of PPP that was distributed. We can make some estimates on the overall impact to the business taxes. But we may not know, you're right, at this point, whether we have already seen that impact or we are still waiting to see that impact. That might be a little bit unclear at this point.
How much was that money? How much came into New Hampshire in payroll protection?
Melissa has that stat.
2.6 billion.
2.6 billion.
It's going to be tough though, isn't it, to figure out if people are doing that as bet or taking it as pure profit at the end, not knowing what the federal government's going to do here.
Correct. So we will have to make some assumptions. We'll probably, like we do, produce a range of the potential impact to the extent that for instance, a nonprofit hospital received PPP, that wouldn't factor into our analysis. They're not taxable under BET or BPT. So we can kind of take those, make those high level assumptions, whittle down the amount, and then we can start to make some assumptions and produce some ranges of the potential impact for PPP.
Commissioner, this is Erin. What percentage of the PPP loans, do you have an estimate on what's going to be forgiven or what's going to be considered a loan yet? And if it's a loan, it's not included as income, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And I don't have that yet. I don't know if that is in our analysis to date. And the federal guidance is kind of still a moving target with respect to that as well, how PPP will ultimately be treated. And again, whether or not federally it will be not only not in income, but also not also then included as a deductible expense. So we'll need to track what happens federally to determine ultimately how we think that'll impact us here in New Hampshire.
Yeah, and they haven't reported yet. The Small Business Association, who's the one who reports out how much has been used, they haven't reported how much has been used as a loan or not. I'm not sure if they will or not.
All right, any other questions on business taxes? Otherwise, we just have a summary slide at the end. The first two columns is obviously fiscal year 2020. You add them together. That's the revenue that you'll be seeing in the CAFR for these taxes when it's released next week. And then to the right, you have the original fiscal year 2021 plan, our new high and low, which does include the anomalous accrual at this point, and then the percent or the dollar value change to plan for each of the taxes, and then the total. So we have a little bit of a wide range here when you take all the taxes into account, 56.3 million below plan to 15.9 above plan. Obviously, with each month that passes, that range will narrow. So at the end of December, we'll have an update on where December came in, and that may inform us better for what we think will happen in the rest of fiscal year 21. Any other questions about revenues, about DRA in general? Happy to answer anything.
Do you guys track the Met revenues?
We do that in conjunction with HHS. So obviously we collect the Medicaid enhancement tax and then we transfer that to DHHS to be used in the distribution or the pool for DISH. They have, because they are in much more constant contact with the hospitals, they have a better handle on what net patient service revenue, which is the base for MET, what net patient service revenue is looking like. I don't have an updated figure from them, but I can certainly get one.
Thanks.
Senator Morris, it looks like you might have a question, but I can't hear you.
Sorry.
No problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
The sorry about that. I should get used to this. When will the documents not carry the anomalies in the figures that we're looking at in 2021?
So you're going to have the anomalous receivable in any cash basis document for all of 21. And then we haven't talked about this much internally, but we will obviously need to remove it to do the growth for 22 and 23. But again, anytime you're looking at cash basis, you'll see the anomalous receivable. If you're looking at the final number from the CAFR for 21, those will be the numbers that will have the anomalous receivable removed and will offset it with the receivable for the next year.
The 56.3 million, you would have to add the 30.8 to that to hit the low?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, and that would be your base for 22 and 23.
Thank you.
So that would be almost $87 million.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions that we can answer? All right, well, thank you very much for having us today. You know how to get a hold of us if you have any questions. I know Senator Del Sandro definitely knows how to get a hold of us with questions, so feel free to reach out anytime. Happy to help and happy to obviously help and be involved throughout the revenue estimating process in the upcoming session.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thanks all of you for joining. In the absence of
Great job.
any other questions, I wish you all the best of the holidays, and we'll see you shortly again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before I can end, I do need you to do a roll call to adjourn of the committee members.
Okay, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second, Hennessy.
Call the roll. So, Senator Gaeta votes aye. Senator Hennessy,
Hennessy, yes.
Senator D'Alessandro,
D'Alessandro votes yes.
Senator Rosenwald. I think her absence signifies yes. Senator Daniels,
Daniels, yes.
Senator Rosenwald still present?
No.
I think she
Okay,
left.
then we'll take that as a successful motion to adjourn. The vote is aye. Thank you all for your work, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I haven't heard from Mickey, Aaron. How's he doing?
He's doing okay. Thanks.
Because I sent out an email yesterday. I usually get a quick return from him.